So Sandrine is the editor for this project at Forbidden Stories. She's a French journalist based in Paris, and Forbidden Stories is this fabulous international project with a hub in Paris coordinating journalists across the world to do the work that has been made impossible through threats or even, as in Daphne Caruana Galicia's case, through a killing. So journalists don't give up, they pick up the stories where they were left. And Szabolcs works with Direct 36 in Hungary, and this is a partner organization that was one of the many partner organizations coordinated by Forbidden Stories. So this hour and 15 minutes that we have here, we will have a discussion among the three of us where Sandrine and Szabolcs will describe the project and describe very much how you worked, because this is something that we can learn so much from. So Sandrine, maybe we can start with you. Could you give us a short summary? I mean, we have read the stories, but give us a quick update of the findings of the Pegasus Project.
Yeah, so for those who were on hold in July, the Pegasus Project is a collaborative investigation of 17 media that was published in July 2021. And it's focusing on a spyware, an invisible and totally invasive spyware called Pegasus and sold by an Israeli company, NSO. And this investigation was led by Forbidden Stories with the technical support and amazing experience and expertise of Amnesty's International Security Lab that published a methodology that is now public and that helped us make the analysis and forensic analysis of the phones we were investigating. So this project started with a leak, 50,000 phone numbers that were entered by NSO clients in a system to potentially target victims of Pegasus spyware. And so based on that leak, we got in touch with the targets. We managed to have many phones analyzed to gather evidence. And we basically found out that many of the targets of the spyware in the world, and we worked on 11 government clients, were basically human rights activists, lawyers, business people, political opponents, journalists. We find almost 200 journalists in our list. And Szabolcs was one of the journalists whose phone was compromised by Pegasus. So on the one side, you have governments using those types of cyber weapons, and the companies, and including NSO, saying that those spyware are very important, are used to track terrorists and criminals all around the world. And what we managed to find and to prove with many evidence was that there is a systematic misuse of these kinds of cyber weapon. And I think for the first time in the world, we knew that there were other other investigation on spyware, other investigation on your phone being spied on, but this was already always very theoretical. And what we managed to show was and to see in that project was the faces behind the numbers, and so it made that surveillance very concrete, and I think this is why it has such an impact. You muted.
So you got started with a leak that was handed to Forbidden Stories, or was there a source relationship that you had to cultivate before you could get access to this information?
So yes, the short answer is that, of course, this project starts with a leak, but just to you reminded what Forbidden Story was doing. Forbidden Story is a non-profit and a media based in Paris, which core mission is to pursue the work of journalists who are silenced, arrested or threatened, or sometimes killed in the world. It was founded in 2017 by Laurent Richard, and we started with the Daphne Project. And when I arrived at Forbidden Stories, we decided to focus on Mexico, because Mexico is the deadliest country for journalists. And working on Mexico, we discovered that many journalists have been already targeted by Pegasus. So we started to investigate Pegasus. We discovered that the family of Javier Valdez, who was a journalist who was killed in Mexico, in Culiacan, and who was investigating cartels, his family, his friends were targeted a few days after his murder by Pegasus. We also discovered, we knew, but we discovered that at the time of the cartel investigation, that many other journalists were spied on with Pegasus in Mexico, because Mexico has been the first client of Pegasus. And then we got interested in NSO in Mexico, and later on we published a story based on an Amnesty report on the surveillance of Omar Adi, who is an investigative Moroccan journalist who is in jail today. And so we focused a lot on the spyware, and this is how we ended up with a list of 50,000 phone numbers. We knew that all those numbers were selected by 11 country clients of NSO, but we only had phone numbers. So one of the first task and mission of this investigation was to find out who was behind the numbers. And one of the things we did to start with was entering our own contact lists and contacts in the system to see if we had any matches. And we had already been in contact. One journalist in our team had been in contact with Szabolcs at the time of an investigation on COVID, and Szabolcs did an amazing investigation on COVID in Hungary. So we had his phone number, and Phineas in our team, Phineas Rigaud, had Szabolcs' phone number in his contact list. So when he entered his whole contact numbers, there was a match, and we saw Szabolcs' number appearing. And so we understood that basically journalists, investigative journalists of a media like Direct 36, who is part of ICIJ, who investigates very important topics, including corruption in Hungary, was targeted, and we understood there was a story. So the first mission was to try to contact Szabolcs and contact him in a safe way, because he might have been still under surveillance. So this was the first challenge, and we asked our partners from Süddeutsche Zeitung, who knew Szabolcs more than us, to get in touch with him and with Andras, his boss. And so this is how we managed to communicate with him, and this is how we asked him to have his phone analyzed with Amnesty's methodology. And this is how we discovered that his phone was actually compromised. And so, we also decided to work with Direct 36, because we had much more Hungarian numbers in that list, but we needed people who had contacts on the ground, who understood the context, who were very good investigative journalists. And basically, Szabolcs and his team, understanding what was at stake at that time, it was quite easy for us to ask them to join the project and to become our partner on that project.
I'll be back with questions to you, Sandrine, on how you build the team in a minute, but maybe Szabolcs, what was your immediate reaction when you were contacted?
Well, it was a process. So first, I only heard from my boss that Frederick Meyer from Süddeutsche Zeitung has asked for my phone number, and I was very proud, because Frederick is such a famous investigative journalist. So I was really looking forward to his call, but he never actually called me. And then my boss told me that Frederick's asking for some other phone numbers, like the phone number belonging to one of the most prominent media entrepreneurs in Hungary, who's owning the largest independent news site right now, or another investigative journalist, Brigitte. So gradually, even before we were told what this whole project is about, we kind of could, put together the pieces. And then, as Sandrine told, it was basically Süddeutsche Zeitung who was the intermediary between Forbidden Stories and us because of security reasons, so that they are not directly involved. So we were asked if we could join a very interesting project, but they couldn't talk about it. What's it actually about? And then we were asked to set up a secure way of communications, and that's how we were told some details. And also, both me and my boss András, who were working on the Hungarian side of the project, we were asked to let our phones analyzed by Amnesty International, and it turned out my phone was compromised. And when I was told about this fact that the spyware was found on my phone, I was freaking out. Mostly because I was at that time working on some sensitive stories. I just broke a big scandal in Hungary about a huge investment into a Chinese university construction, and I was really afraid of my sources, that they could get into trouble. But I was soon told that I don't have to be afraid, because there are no recent traces of infection on my phone since the end of 2019. And actually, the phone that I have right now, it's not physically the phone that I owned back in those days when it was infected. So it's only the iCloud backup that somehow kept traces of the spyware. So then it was reassuring, but it has been an emotional roller coaster to use this expression.
I bet it was. Sandrine, so going back to the sort of work process, and then Shabolt will get back to you in a minute. So that one first impression of your work is really interesting to me, that there was not a leak out of the blue. You were working in the field on the topic, doing research, and so then you got the leak, obtained the leak at some point, which is, I think, really interesting to hear for people who are not working in the field of journalism immediately, because this leak everybody's waiting for is so abstract, and many of the colleagues I know have gotten leaks when they have worked in a field or shown interest and expertise over months and maybe years on a particular topic, and then some source contacted them with a leak. So I find that interesting that you worked in Mexico, and so but then you're there with the leak, and you cross-check whom you know, and you start establishing an overview at Forbidden Stories, which functions as the coordination hub. And then you reach out to potential team members. And as we saw with Shabolt, you did that in a secure way through colleagues that Shabolt already knew and trusted, and so that you also knew and trusted, and so you established a contact like that. How did you compose the team? How did you select the countries? How did you select the colleagues you wanted to work with? I mean, not everybody was on your list.
Yeah, it's a long process. So we first work here as Forbidden Stories with our team of journalists on the list for a while. We fact-check the list. We try to identify as many numbers as possible. We try to identify stories, context, and understand. All this happens in the time of COVID, which we have to underline, because basically the easiest way to pitch people on the project was to see them, and this was the most secure way, but it was very complicated to travel at that time, almost impossible. So that made things very, very complicated. So we first contacted the partners whom we knew for a very long time and whom we've worked with since the beginning of Forbidden Stories, so Süddeutsche Zeitung, with Frederic and Bastian. We also contacted Le Monde, our partners here in France. We contacted the Guardian. We also worked with the Washington Post on that. So we needed big big media newsrooms, because we knew that it was a big project, and we knew we had the need to work with those very solid partners, with many journalists who would be able to go on the ground. But we also needed to have people who had a very, very good knowledge of some countries we were specifically working on. And this is why we decided to open up to new partners, typically Direct 36. We knew them from reputation, we knew they were part of the ICIJ, but I mean, I had never met Shablogs before, and so we find a way to create that contact and to work in a secure way. But we also did that for colleagues in India, because there was a huge story. We felt it from the beginning when we started discovering Indian numbers, and there was a huge story in India, but we didn't have all that background. We didn't have those contact lists that would make the investigation possible. And we also had to convince people on the ground to give us their phone. And if you're not Indian, it's much more complicated. And we could not go to India at that time. So we decided to work with our colleagues from The Wire. The Wire is also an online investigative media. And we also started with the discovery of two of their founders in our list, so Siddhar Vadarajan and MK Venu. So through a journalist in India we've been working with, we contacted them in a very secure way as well, and then we asked them, once we had their phone analyzed, when they understood what the project was about and the stake of the project, we asked them to join the project. So we probably could have worked, I mean, for a project like this, we could have been 300, 400, but it was impossible to handle that in a secure way. So we had to limit the number of journalists for security reasons. We had to limit the time of the investigation, also for security reasons. This is why the investigation with the group only lasted for 6 months and not more. We could have worked on that list for years, but it wouldn't have been, I think, very, very realistic, and we would have need to do that with a very small group. So yeah, there was a balance of an assessment of the risk, and so we ended up with 80 journalists, 16 partners, and quite a short, I mean, it's a long investigation. 6 months is huge, but for this type of story, basically it could be more.
Obviously, yeah. The security is of course really important. We heard from Schabold that you contacted him via trusted contacts. So via Süddeutsche Zeitung, which was a partner that you both knew. So trust is an important element. There was also a question in the chat: what software did you use to reach out securely to the journalists, the colleagues you wanted to work with?
We have a very, very strict security protocol, and not communicating about our means of communication is part of the protocol. So I'm very sorry, it's very frustrating, but yeah, this was the rule from the beginning, and we ask all the partners to respect that.
That's fair enough. It is also, it sharpens the attention on a story like this. And obviously, in this week's seminar, where we talk about indeed security, that's yet another important consideration, that we may even not be able to discuss our means of communication even when we talk with colleagues. So you are setting up the team, and how was it difficult to bring in people? Did they say, wow, yes, I'll join? Or did you have to go through, I mean, it sounds as if you go through a very careful vetting process for each team member, so upon recommendation or trusted contacts.
Yeah, and we managed, I mean, we had to see them in person as much as we could, of course. No, when when journalists and partners discover the list, discover the stories behind the list, they join immediately. Journalistically speaking, it was quite a challenge and an interesting, very interesting investigation to lead. So the partners were on board when we were able to pitch them the story, but we had to pitch them in a very careful way. So it took us some time to let the people understood what we were dealing with, and so yeah, it took some time. We started often in one newsroom with a very limited number of journalists. At Le Monde, for example, we started with Martin Untersinger and Damien Leloup, who are two tech specialists and cyber surveillance specialists at Le Monde. And then we opened up the team by the end when the risk was more limited. It was more limited because we knew that publication was coming. So we opened it up to correspondents or people who had more geographical knowledge of specific countries we wanted to focus on.
Mm-hmm. And then the research started in the individual cases. Szabolcs, maybe you can tell a little bit more about the Hungarian story, if I may call you that. Journalists don't want to be the story, but in this case you were both the story and the investigative journalist looking into the Hungarian case.
Yeah, well, I think I was not that special because we had colleagues in our team from India and I believe from Mexico who were having this dual role as well. And I believe in Mexico it was even more serious because not just journalists were surveilled, journalists who then participated in the project, but their immediate circles, so friends and family members. And it also turned out in my case that I had one of my immediate colleagues from Direct 36, his name is András Szabó, whose phone number also appeared on the list. So actually there are two journalists from my outlet who were surveyed with Pegasus. As Sandrine said, this leak contained phone numbers and most of the work was, or a large chunk of the work was to identify who actually uses those phone numbers. And we used different methods for that research. And by the time we were involved in the project, some of the more important numbers were already discovered by the partners. So we also tried to put in our contact lists and gathered the thousands of phone numbers from acquaintances, from people who are well connected and have lots of businessmen and politicians in their phone books. And we also used other methods. There are some, in every country, there are some social media applications that are popular, but they are not well known outside of the country. So we also tried to put in those records to the research and identified some more targets. But the real problem was that although we could identify some people, we didn't know the story behind it, and it took a lot of consideration to just assess whether someone is an illegitimate or legitimate target. When it comes to a businessman, even if the businessman is involved in media, there could be legitimate investigations into tax fraud or something like that. And also when for example reaching out to some journalists, we had to be careful, because what if we tip them off and they would just publish the story? Because they are journalists, we are very individualistic. But everyone was really nice, and everyone was cooperating, and everyone understood the seriousness of this project. So I guess after the research part and after identifying the targets, the next phase was reaching out to people, and just as it happened to me, we couldn't tell to these people directly why we are reaching out to them. So we couldn't talk about the scope of the project. We couldn't name forbidden stories for some time. We couldn't name the spyware itself. But at the same time, we had to convince these people to hand over their phones or let us analyze their phones without telling them exactly why we need that. So it was quite tricky. And we had, for example, one journalist from Hungary who didn't want to be named in the story, but after the story came out, She then changed her mind, and we could identify her as Brigitte. She was afraid of sources, and she wasn't fully understanding the scope of the project because we couldn't tell her. So there were all these complications, but mostly it came down to, as it was said, trust. So I guess involving journalists who are trustworthy, who are known in their countries, does help. That that there's some credibility to these very serious allegations, and also a large part then of the investigation was to sit down with these people, or in my case, sit down with myself, and just try to understand why the hell was I surveilled. And the only or the biggest evidence that we had was in many cases that Amnesty analyzed our phones. So we had a set of dates of times when some files were accessed on the phone, some corrupt processes belonging to Pegasus were running on the phone, and we tried to match those dates with. I can tell about my example. I went through my old diaries, my calendars, my email correspondences, and try to find out what I was working on, whom I was meeting, why was that particular day or period of time in the year important for someone. So it's not easy, especially because it happened years ago. In my case, it happened in 2019. We had Hungarian cases from 2018. But it turns out that there were very clear patterns. So right now we have at least 6 journalists, including a fixer for a journalist who were targeted. All of these cases are totally illegitimate. So we talked with all these people, and it turns out that they were all, including myself, working on stories that were sensitive to Viktor Orban's government. Some of these journalists are outright investigative journalists. Some of them are newsroom journalists who happen to work on some sensitive stories back in those days when they were surveilled. And we also identified at least 2, right now 3 media company owners. One of them was the arch enemy of Viktor Orban back in 2018. He himself, his name is Zajos Simichka. He didn't use a smartphone. He's a very old school guy, but his own son and his most trusted lawyer and right-hand man were both targeted. Then there was Mr. Zoltán Varga, whom I mentioned previously. He's the owner of the last largest independent news outlet in Hungary. He happened to have a dinner for 6 of his friends. All 7 participants, including him, were selected for targeting with Pegasus. We could confirm that multiple of his guests were successfully infected with the spyware, and it's very interesting that even after publishing the Pegasus Project stories back in July and in the summer, we identified new targets who were very recently targeted just this year. So we identified a media company owner named Zoltán Páva, who owns an opposition leaning operation. And also we identified a very kick-ass investigative reporter who's also a photographer who tries to document the luxury lifestyle of Viktor Orban's circles. And they were both targeted this year in March and May and in July. So the Hungary story is pretty clear, I guess. Media company owners, journalists, all of them are either working on stories that are directly hurting the reputation of the Hungarian government, or they provide jobs to journalists who do exactly that kind of job. And then, of course, there were many famous lawyers, including the head of Hungary's Bar Association, and some opposition politicians also appeared on the list. So it was a clear pattern of systematic abuse. And as I said, we had to go through lots of phone numbers, identify who handles those phones, and then try to dig through the memories of these people or the records to try to identify what is exactly the story behind these surveillances.
It sounds like a very clear pattern of who was under surveillance there, and it also sounds like a massive work in trust building between you and the various sources that you then reached out to.
Yes, and there's also a very interesting psychological side to it. We even joked with some of the fellow targets that we should throw a Pegasus party where only those who are surveilled are invited. No, I mean, of course, it was not easy to handle the thought that I was surveilled in a 7 months period, but mostly what was demanding is to hear some of the stories of people who have much more to lose than I do. I'm just a journalist, but for example, Mr. Zoltán Varga, this media company owner, he has billions of forints. He's a wealthy man. He has a lot to lose, and he's quite brave because he's been pressured and he's been blackmailed by government proxies for years to sell his media company to Viktor Orbán's people, and he refused, or he's been pressured to fire some of his journalists, or and he refused that too. And all the harassment, all the physical surveillance that he had to endure. Sometimes there were helicopters flying in to his garden, and then his family had to flee in to their house because they were frightened what's happening. So hearing those kinds of stories, that was that pissed me off, and also it was very eye-opening to see what thing happened in an EU member state. And trust building was also crucial before publication, because we didn't know what the reaction of certain authorities could be. And since we were all connected to the same communications group, if just one member of the team is compromised, if just one device is compromised, then it can be a huge problem for all of us. And for me especially, it was I was really afraid that I'm going to be the one, because I was surveilled previously, so there's a track record of certain security agencies following me. That what if I log into the wrong device? What if I make some mistake and then the whole thing will just blow up because of me? So that was one of my biggest concerns throughout the whole project. But I was pretty cautious, so I managed to avoid that risk.
Yeah, and with this we sort of move slowly towards security, which I would also like to talk more about. But one question in between, as you tell this, and you, Sandrine, having the overview over the entire team, must have experienced quite a few colleagues with very similar concerns to Sabolt's, which also means that you need to deal with some mentally heavy, very, very tense time, so that everybody is really tense to not make a mistake. Some have been under surveillance already, maybe concerned for their sources, etc. So how do you deal with this immense mental tension?
It's clearly the most, for me at least, and I think for many journalists, it was clearly one of the most dangerous projects I had to work on. You do not only deal with a company that is selling the most invasive and sophisticated spyware in the world, you're also dealing with countries that are the worst regime in the world. I mean, you're working on Saudi Arabia that is murdering journalists in consulates. You work on stories in the worst regimes and people who have this this habit of threatening, of arresting, of killing anybody who would challenge their authority. So it's clearly security was at the core of everything. Those months were really intense, and we really realized working on that list that it wasn't something abstract. I mean, at one point we have Élodie Guéguin, journalist from Radio France, who was in touch with the French wife of American political prisoner, Claude Mangin, and so she had Claude's phone analyzed, and we discovered that Claude was just targeted and his phone was compromised the day before Élodie was with her, and so basically at the time of the meeting they could have been spied on, and we discovered that people we were contacted were spied on at the time we got in touch with them. So hopefully we were very careful, but at some point you still have to say some things to let people understand that things are serious and they have to meet you. And by the end, so Claude Mangin gave to Élodie her phone for analyze, and then Radio France gave another phone to Claude. So she had a phone for a week, and when we got the phone back, the phone she had for a week, it was compromised again. So I mean, we were doing an investigation, and at the time of the crime was happening. So it was really serious. We had to be very careful. We had to be very careful about the way we contacted people. And for example, in the case of Azerbaijan, we knew that Khadija Ismailova, a very investigative journalist in Azerbaijan, was in the list, but this journalist is always under surveillance. So we had to wait for her to leave the country, to be in Berlin, and then have her phone analyzed and have a team meeting her there. So our first concern was not to put people in danger. They already are, so we didn't want to make that worse. And there was also a human part of that investigation that was quite heavy to handle, because at one point you have to tell to some people that, I mean, their phone were spied on, all their secrets, their personal photos, their personal emails, everything in their phone was potentially extracted from the phone in the hands of people who were not acting for their welfare. So this was very complicated. And I remember when the team of OCCRP and Forbidden Stories said to Khadija that her phone was compromised, her first reaction was to feel guilty. I mean, she was feeling guilty for all the people she was in contact with. And this was quite a trauma for her. And it was a trauma for all the people we contacted, whether you're a journalist in France where you think that you're quite safe, or a journalist in a country where you know that you're under threat, but you still think that you can communicate on Signal safely, and then you realize that all what you shared on Signal could have been compromised at some point. So there was this human part of the investigation we have to deal with, and we had to be very careful about the people we wanted to get in touch with and the targets.
Yeah, so there was the digital security side of things, but then also the psychological debriefing side of things, both with the sources, I assume, and with the team, because dealing with such potential trauma is heavy work for journalists. Maybe Shabolt, you mentioned yesterday in our preparation talk that you had gotten security lessons from Amnesty, and you were closely working with Amnesty on all this. Maybe we could turn to that, and then afterwards we opened for questions to the participants.
Well, the bottom line is that no phone can be trusted, and no device that's connected to the internet can be trusted. But there, I mean, still, I think we're in a part of time in history where this whole spyware thing is just starting. So right now, all these tools like Pegasus, they are extremely expensive. it means that it in itself limits the scope of people that could be targeted. So it is mass surveillance, but they still cannot go after everyone. And I think that this will change with time as these tools become more and more accessible, more and more affordable. It also means that there will be hundreds of thousands, if not millions more, who could be surveilled with these tools. So I guess the lessons that I learned are just lessons for everyone. I'm afraid. Well, first of all, what we know about with Pegasus is that this tool identifies your phone through its phone number. So you have to have a SIM card in the phone for Pegasus to geolocate your phone and then identify your phone and then to infect your phone. So everything that doesn't have a SIM card in it, it's maybe a little safer. And also we know that all spyware manufacturers, including Pegasus, because of economic reasons, they mostly develop their tools to infiltrate the built-in vulnerabilities of the most popular applications. So if you can get rid of using those applications, for example, in my case, if I turn off FaceTime and iMessage, which are very known targets of the Pegasus spyware, then you're a little safer. Also, there's a history of well-known case of a mass targeting of WhatsApp users. The Safari browser also has some vulnerabilities. So if you can, and this is the advice that I got, if I can just use newer and less popular applications, and if I can avoid using FaceTime and iMessage, maybe that's better. And also just and I think we can reveal this huge secret in our communication, so we don't have our mobile phones in the room when we are communicating about Pegasus. Just put your phone elsewhere, leave it in another room. If you have any sensitive discussion with anyone, don't have your phone around. But the problem is that right now we know a lot of things about how Pegasus works, and we know some things about how we can defend ourselves against Pegasus, but there are so many other tools out there. And we know that even Pegasus can not just infect phones, but for example, Apple Watches. If you have a personal assistant in your home, Siri or Alexa, that can also be potentially a vulnerability used by some other spyware tool, not Pegasus, but some others. So if you can just get rid of these things, maybe that's better. And also what I know about my surveillance and what we suspect about some other Hungarian cases is that these are not real-time surveillances for weeks or months. They are checking into your phone and downloading your data from time to time. They check in like every week, and sometimes there are periods of time when you are surveilled, probably real-time, 24/7. But this also means that if you just use if you just use timed messages, if the messages disappear after like 5 minutes or 1 hour, maybe there's a chance that you're safer, because by the time they check into your phone, the messages are already gone. So these are just some very basic things, and in the end, just leave your phone behind when you have any more sensitive conversation. And also the other problem is that we know, for example, in Hungary, that when the Hungarian security agency deploys Pegasus on your phone, we suspect that this already happens when you already have physical surveillance in you, when your phone has already been wiretapped, and when they know exactly that you are using encrypted communications and that they couldn't crack. So that's when they have to bring in, the heavy artillery Pegasus. So it means that you can defend yourself against Pegasus. Still, you would have other means of surveillance on you still.
So it's back to the good old paper days where you write a little note on a piece of paper. You make sure that there's no paper underneath, so don't leave a trace there, and then you burn the paper. I would like to open. I see there are questions coming in the chat. Trine, you have kept an eye on the questions. Let's open for the questions from the participants.
There is a question from Federico asking, I think both of you, do you think it's necessary, and I could add possible to regulate the market of spyware applications, or at least make it more transparent? This is a way to regulate it.
There is, of course, the publication of the Pegasus Project opened a whole debate on regulation, but there are some solutions. I think not easy solution. Governments will always say that they will need those kind of spyware to track us and criminals. What is very striking, I think, is the lack of transparency. Even if in the EU we don't know who is buying and who is using NSO. I mean, after we understood that a majority of NSO clients are European today, and I think this explains probably the reaction, the non-reaction almost of European authorities. There was a debate in Parliament, and MEPs are asking for answers. But in France, we were very surprised of the non-reaction of the French government. Basically, we know that Emmanuel Macron is appearing on the list with the phone he was using at the time he was president. We know that almost the entire French government has been targeted, and there was a leak that was published by Mediapart a few weeks ago, confirming that the phones of 5 ministers were indeed having some traces of Pegasus in France. So, I mean, this is a reality. The French government and the French president could be spied on, so nobody can protect himself against such attacks, even if the French authorities cannot. But why didn't they react? I think there are probably many underground discussions going out right now. I think it might be humiliating for a government to discover it can be vulnerable to such a spyware. I know they had to use Amnesty's international methodology. So basically, even the French intelligence is now using an Amnesty solution to try to have their phone analyzed. So what is the discussion? What are the discussions right now between French authorities and American authorities, or between the French and the Israeli authorities? The Israeli Minister of Defense had to come to France and had a discussion with a minister, but this is not public. What's going on is not public. We as a journalist are asking for many questions openly, and those are questions of national interest. And for the moment, we don't have answers even from the European Union. So let's imagine what answer we could get from Saudi Arabia or Morocco or the Emirates. So I think transparency is the first thing as a journalist that you're asking, and those answers need to be given at some point. So we're going to push for more answers, and we are still working on that. And we're not switching like this.
Yeah, and following up on the security side of things, obviously what you indicated, Sandrine, that it may be embarrassing that they were not able to protect the president or the government against such attacks. That may be an issue, but what you're working with, or what you have documented with the Pegasus project, is that politicians, journalists, media were under attack, but with digital attacks, I mean, or cybersecurity in general, our entire society is potentially under attack. We have seen more and more frequently attacks against critical infrastructure. This is massive. So it's interesting that you get no reactions. If you could, I mean, I assume that you will continue either as Forbidden Stories or the team members, the partners will continue working with the topic. If other journalists would pick up on cybersecurity, where would you start?
There are many other spyware to investigate. Many, we heard from some sources that there were tens of companies that were trying to do what NSO was doing and was selling. So I think we probably there are much more investigation to have on those kinds of tools. I think we have to investigate what Russia or China is selling to some countries in the world. Most of those companies are totally, are acting in the shadow. So we don't even, in some cases, know their names. So there's much more to do. And as Shabolts was saying, and I think it's something Edward Snowden was saying when he was interviewed on the Pegasus Project after its publication, we're now talking of 50,000 persons. But if nothing happens, I mean, in 5 years, it could be 50 million people, basically, because for the moment, those technology are still a bit costly, but the price will diminish as for every technology. When it's getting more common, the price is getting low. So I think there is everything to do. It's only the beginning of something that we should all be interested in.
Are you aware of any countries where there is regulation, where there is where there are court cases? I remember vaguely, but I'm not deeply into it. From Germany, there was court cases against the so-called Staatstrojaner, so the Trojan, the surveillance spyware by the government, potentially used against journalists. We would have to read up on that. But are you aware of any states where this is on the political agenda? Or
in a way, I mean, this market is already a bit regulated. I mean, NSO cannot sell its spyware without a license from the Israeli Minister of Defense. So it could be considered as a form of regulation. The problem is we don't know. We don't know anything about this license. I mean, NSO got a license to sell to Saudi Arabia, got a license to sell to Azerbaijan, got a license to sell to many countries that we could not consider as really exemplary democracies. So I think, and should we limit the use of those tools to democracy? I mean, Hungary is considered as a major democracy. India is considered as a democracy. Mexico as well. So, I mean, regulation is probably a big issue, and I will leave that to politicians. We have in Europe and even in Hungary's laws that are supposed to protect citizens against the misuse of such technology, and then we were able to prove and to publish stories showing that those laws were not respected. And I don't know what's going to happen now. We're following very carefully what's going to happen in Hungary or in India, where the Supreme Court is investigating the misuse of Pegasus. But this is, of course, is becoming very political in countries where we have leaders that would probably not accept independent investigations of the use of such tools. So we have to keep on putting some pressure on our side, asking for Europe probably to be more vocal about the use of those tools, knowing in Europe who's using those tools. I think what we've seen as well is that Europe was not very well protected. We know that, for example, Pegasus cannot target any American number. We discovered that basically French number were very easily targetable. So, I mean, this opens a lot of questions that are goes beyond only technical use of Pegasus, but geopolitics and yeah, the powers in the world today.
Who issues those licenses? Just a quick, who issues the licenses? You said that they need a license.
Yeah, from the Ministry of Defense, Israeli Ministry of Defense.
Okay. Yeah. And one quick follow-up also on the use of Pegasus is difficult on US phone numbers, but easier on European.
So what NSO says, and what we basically we don't have any proof that they're on that they're not saying the truth, is that basically American phone numbers, when you enter an American phone number in the Pegasus system, it cannot be infected. So yeah, this is what the company says, and we haven't found or we haven't analyzed any American phone that was basically compromised.
Okay, thank you. I have another question, but Trine, are there? You are keeping a track with the chat. Are there questions there? I don't want to occupy everything.
I think that they have the only question that is there, which is maybe more of a comment, is Marius asking how can we regulate something which we do not know if it's existing. But I think we do know that it is existing, and I think it's been answered indirectly both by Sharples and Sandrine, that it is existing, and there will be more of it, and it will be even more and more difficult to find out how much we're being surveilled, because there would be so much more different software out there. So so that's the only thing for now.
All right.
But I can also add that some of these questions of what we can demand from our politicians and where the problems are will be taken up in the next panel as well. That's beginning at 11:30.
Which is indeed about the EU's cybersecurity strategies. Yeah. One question to you, Shabold. Sandrine talked about a no reaction or close to a no reaction to your publications in France. What was the reaction in Hungary? Was it another no reaction, or how was the reaction?
It was extremely interesting. So our government is known for being very disciplined in its communications, and in the first few days, they were like contradictory comments from cabinet members, but soon they became again centralized in their messages, which was basically that they're not denying that they are using Pegasus in Hungary. All kinds of ministers have been commenting on it, saying that, for example, every state needs such tools. Why we would be stupid not to have such a tool, but they are not admitting that they acquired Pegasus. Then there were comments from our foreign minister, whom I interviewed a couple of years ago, saying that we do not surveil people based on their profession, but we are surveilling people based on the fact that they pose risks to Hungarian national security or national interest, regardless of their profession. And then there were some other very interesting comments from our Minister of Interior, who even accused some journalists who asked questions whether you bought Pegasus and you're using Pegasus, saying that if I would reply to that question, I would break some state secrets, and you could also get into trouble because you were the one who asked that question that led to a crime. So right now, what we see is that the Hungarian government is not even debating that those people whom we identified as targets of the surveillance, that they were indeed targeted. they are trying to stonewall every kind of investigation. It turns out that we already knew that there's no civilian oversight, basically no oversight over how our security apparatus works. But it became very obvious when the opposition tried to launch an investigation into the Pegasus surveillance in Parliament, and the government could basically obstruct it in a very simple way. Their MPs didn't show up at the committee meeting. There was no quorum, so they couldn't investigate. And then they had another hearing, and everything that was said there was classified until 2050. So I'm going to be in my mid-60s by the time that it became public what happened. So right now what we see is that the Hungarian government is not denying it. They are trying not to talk about it. But my impression is that they still don't know what we have and what kind of stories we can come out with. So they are trying not to put out many public comments on it. But the real problem is that there's basically no way for us not just journalists but as victims to seek justice. There is a Hungarian prosecutor investigating the case, but we already know, I've been interrogated by this prosecutor, that they're not going to find anything.
There is a question now from Sarah Pilz. Sarah, do you want to unmute yourself, or should we read it up? I think yeah.
Sarah cannot unmute herself. She is logged on to listen only, so you can read it aloud, Brigitte.
All right. Sarah asks the framing of these issues when you do the reporting. Some people are, she says there's a generation which is growing up with being monitored and can't imagine a life without Alexa. How should we frame these issues to maximize the impact of such research when we care about surveillance and digital security? And that's a sort of really a generation question of those who are growing up with surveillance.
Yeah, for a time, I don't know if Shabak is here, but for a time we heard that that if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to be afraid of. I think this was the time of the Edward Snowden revelation with the question of the metadata. So everybody understood they were under surveillance, but the message was if you have nothing to hide on, but you have nothing to be afraid of. And we're seeing with the Pegasus Project that these are clear attacks against democracies. I mean, the use of those tools are made for silencing people, either because you threaten them directly, you blackmail them, you basically you make them aware that they are under surveillance, so they don't. They limit their connection with the rest of the world. So this is a clear attack against democracy. And what we're seeing now is an attack against people who are investigating corruption at the highest level, who are fighting for their rights. All the people we've been working on are people who are engaged in a battle for democracy. So I think this is what we have to keep in mind. I mean, it's not totally random. Those are not random attacks. They are basically it's massive, but we're not speaking of a massive program of surveillance. I mean, it's massive because the number is amazing of targets we've been able to identify, but people were targeted for a reason. When you target somebody like Szabolcs in Hungary, Direct 36 is one of the few independent media. There was a total crackdown on press. And what's happening now? With that project, you realize that basically at one point, you might have frightened some of the sources, or that might have been the objective. You might have tried to find out who who Shabolts was investigating on. So I mean, this is not something we can take lightly. It's a very, very serious attack, and I think one of the most serious attack, because invisible as well, against democracies. So it's a topic we have to investigate more and more.
So maybe we should reframe it, and rather than say surveillance, really declare this an attack on the security of journalists, an attack on the security of sources, political threats. And if we move to other aspects of cybersecurity, it's an attack on our society's infrastructures, as we have seen in some places, so that we frame it like that rather than the abstract term of surveillance, that we frame it as what it is, as you say. It's a threat, it's an attack on journalists. Yeah. Right. We have one more question and 2 more minutes, so I'll just read it up quickly. It's Konstantina Maltepioti. She asks, if you're a freelancer and you may be more vulnerable than when you are part of an organization, what are the steps to take? Whom do you contact when you suspect you are under surveillance or somebody's watching you? So that's a very practical question. How do you react? What do you do when you are afraid that somebody's watching?
I don't know, Charlotte, if you want to answer, perhaps you have ideas. I mean, there are always structures working on cyber surveillance, and Amnesty Security Lab or Citizen Lab have been focusing on those tools for years now. They're very good experts, technical experts. They can also probably provide advice, legal advice, or any kind of advice to help you on that. I think they've been very solicited after the publication of the Pegasus Project, but yeah, those are the main structure today working on those questions.
Yeah, and then it's something that we need to update ourselves and each other on constantly, as there are constant technical developments. Yeah. Trina is posting a few links in the chat. Yes, I have the sad task of concluding, because it's such an interesting conversation and so important. But we'll have to sort of sum up and conclude this meeting. I very much hope to see you again among the journalism community, so that we can share our concerns and our knowledge and experience with how to deal with this kind of security.